Today we're going to be talking about expanding the lavender industry in Missouri. So we have just completed a 3-year lavender research project here in the state of Missouri. This project was funded through the Missouri Department of Agriculture Specialty Crop Block Grant Program, and research plots were located at 4 different locations around the state of Missouri. There was a research plot in Kirksville, Missouri, a research plot in St. Genevieve, one in Springfield, and one in Mount Vernon. And the purpose of all of these different research plots was to compare and contrast how different cultivars of lavender do throughout the year, and therefore we can put together some grower guides for people that are interested in growing lavender in Missouri. We use 6 main cultivars for this project. These include Dutch Mill, Grosso, Munstead, Hidcote, Phenomenal, and Provence. And we chose these 6 cultivars as kind of a response of what we had heard from other lavender growers, ones that they had had success with, ones that had done well, ones that were easily able to acquire. So those are the ones that we chose for this particular research. So why did we study lavender? Well, my colleagues and I at University of Missouri Extension had been receiving a lot of inquiries from homeowners and those that wanted to grow lavender commercially. There are no grower guides for lavender in Missouri. Some of our neighboring states have lavender grower guides, but we didn't here in Missouri. So after hearing from a lot of people that were interested in it, that's where the lavender research came from and has gone from there. Lavender is a crop that can be profitable on a small amount of acreage. You don't have to have 40 acres to grow lavender. You can have success with just a very small plot, less than 1/4 of an acre, and you can be successful with just a small amount of space. There's also a lot of value-added products that can be made from lavender, whether it be essential oil, lavender bundles, baked goods, the list goes on and on. You can do a lot of different things with lavender, and it's very popular. People are very interested in purchasing those types of products. The potential for agritourism is also huge with lavender. People enjoy going out to the farm with their family, taking photos, harvesting lavender, just getting that on-farm experience. So that is also a big part of the lavender industry. Another thing that is very popular with lavender is distilling the essential oil. We did do oil distillation as a part of our research, and we're going to have a separate video on how that process works. But essential oil is very popular, and just a small vial of oil like this can retail for $20 or more. So it is a very powerful product, and certainly a lot of demand for that product as well. So let's talk a little bit about the history of lavender and a little bit about the plant itself. So lavender originates from arid desert climates of the world, and a lot of people don't realize that it is a desert plant. So if you think about that in terms of being successful with lavender in Missouri, we need to be able to mimic those desert-like growing climates as best we can to be able to be successful with it here. So knowing that it's a desert plant, it's going to like hot, dry summers, which we certainly have plenty of here in Missouri, but it also needs well-drained soil. And so that is kind of our limiting factor of growing lavender here in Missouri, is having that well-drained soil. We do have periods of lots of moisture. Certainly it's hit and miss at any time of the year, but we need to think about that when we're setting up our fields for lavender production. What can we do to increase that soil drainage? And we're going to talk about some things in just a moment on how to do that. Lavender is a woody shrub, and it can live up to 10 years if it is in a good spot that it likes. It's very possible to have a plant that can live many, many years. And again, we'll talk about some ways to be successful with that in just a moment. Most commercial lavender is grown in France, and that is something that we want to change. We want to see more lavender production done here in the United States and done here in Missouri. Why import lavender and lavender products from France when it's something that we can grow here in our own country? Lavender can also be grown in poor soils. It has been used in bioremediation of areas that have had soil contamination, whether it's been some kind of a chemical spill or something to that effect. Lavender can be planted in those areas, and the plant is able to absorb heavy metals and other contaminants in the soil and kind of heal that soil and bioremediate that soil. So that's a pretty cool thing that lavender can do, besides just being a beautiful plant that we enjoy the flowers. So lavender is a perennial shrub in the mint family or the Lamiaceae family. And if you're not familiar with plants in the Lamiaceae family, they can be characterized by square stems. So if you take the stems of a lavender plant and you kind of just feel of them, you'll notice that they have square stems, and that's going to be the case in any mint family type of plant. They also have an opposite leaf arrangement, and they are very aromatic. You can smell them very easily. So that's just some characteristics of the plant. Also be aware of the mature size of lavender plants. Some can be very small. They're actually miniature varieties that can be just a few inches in diameter and height. And then there's some that can be very, very large and can be several feet in width and height. So make sure you know what type of lavender you're planting and that you give it enough row spacing when you're planting it in the ground. So lavender flowers are clustered on a spike called an inflorescence. Flowering time is typically from about May to our first frost. And we really encourage people who are wanting to grow lavender to grow a variety of different cultivars. Some are going to bloom earlier. Those are typically our English lavender type varieties. Those are going to be the ones that start blooming in May. And then some of our other hybrid types will bloom throughout the summer and again up until first frost. So have a variety and then you'll have those blooms throughout the growing season. Lavender is pretty cool because once it blooms, the duration of those blooms will be about 2 to 3 weeks. So even if you don't harvest your flowers, you just want to have, flowering plants in the field, you will have about a 2 to 3 week window when your plants are going to be in peak bloom. And then another great thing about lavender is that there are lots of different colors. Now, certainly lavender is a purple flower, and the spectrum of that purple color can be anywhere from really light purple to really dark purple. And if you see a bunch of different lavender types put together, you can really see the difference in that purple pigment. There's also white varieties, there's pink varieties as well. So experiment with some of these different colors and see which ones that you prefer. So most people are familiar with English types of lavender, and in our particular research project, we used Hidcote and Munstead, which are a couple of the most popular English types of lavender. Now remember, English lavenders are going to be the earliest blooming ones once we get into late spring and early summer. And English type lavenders are ones that are used in culinary type dishes, whether you want to bake with it, whether you want to use it in cooking. They can be used in savory dishes, they can be used in baked goods, but these English type lavenders are often what is preferred because the taste isn't as strong as some of the other hybrid types of lavender. So So we start out with the English types, and then some of our lavendulas, our other types, are French hybrids. In our research, we used Grosso, Provence, Dutch Mill, and Phenomenal. Now, these 6 types of lavenders were just the ones that we did in our research, but we actually experimented with close to 30 different types, and we had pretty good success with all of those. So again, I encourage you to experiment with different cultivars on your farm or in your garden. So let's talk a little bit about caring for lavender plants. Lavender plants can be a little bit pricey. They are a perennial plant, so you want to do all that you can do to take care of those plants, to get them to live from year to year and to be good producers. When you first purchase lavender plants, they're usually going to be rooted plugs. And so if you're not familiar with that term, lavender can be easily propagated by just taking little cuttings from plants that you already have. Those little cuttings are then dipped in rooting hormone and potted up, and then they will produce a root system and start a whole new plant. So often when you buy lavender plants, that's what they are. They're rooted cuttings, they're very young. And so when you bring those plants home, you don't want to just put them directly out in the field on a really hot summer day. They're going to need some care for the first 1 to 2 growing seasons. So you want to make sure that you have a system in place to water those plants, and you want to monitor them closely, especially during that first summer. They're little plants and they can dry out quickly and die. What we've used in our research plots is drip irrigation. So we had rows of lavender. We had a header line that went down the full length of our plot, and then we had drip irrigation lines that ran down each row. That worked pretty well. It kept the plants well watered. It does it very, very slowly by just dripping out drops of water at a time. You can also set that up on a timer if you're going to be away from town. So that's a good idea as well. But just make sure that they don't dry out that first growing season. One great thing about lavender is that it is not a plant that is fussy or needs a lot of special care once it's established. And that goes for fertilizer as well. Often as gardeners and farmers, we rely a lot on fertilizer and put a lot of thought into how much and what types that we use. But with lavender, there's no ongoing fertilizer that's needed. Now, certainly at the time of planting, we want to do a soil test. We want to see if our soil is deficient on any of the nutrients that lavender need. We also want to find out what the pH of our soil is, what the organic matter percentage of our soil is, and so we can correct any of those deficiencies. But once we have done our soil test, we have corrected our deficiencies, there's really no ongoing fertilization needed. The plant, again, it's a desert plant. It's used to growing in poor soils. And so we don't want to give it a lot of rich soil because that's going to hold water and cause root rot and other issues. One interesting thing about our research is that we grew it in our native Missouri soil. And if you're not from Missouri, we typically have a lot of clay in a lot of areas around the state. Our soil is high in clay. We also have a very thin topsoil layer, usually just a few inches, and there's a lot of rocks as well. And from a typical crop production standpoint, that might not sound like the best way to grow crops, but lavender can tolerate those conditions and thrive. It doesn't need, heavy composted soil or anything like that. Our native Missouri soil will work just fine, but we do want to make sure that we're getting a soil test and, again, correcting any deficiencies. You will need to prune your plants annually. Okay, and this is going to prevent that plant from getting overly woody, and it's going to keep that flower production at its peak. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment, the correct way to prune a lavender plant. Also, you want to make sure that you're planting your lavender in full sun. Lavender, again, I've said this a few times already, but it is a desert plant. It needs full sun. It can survive in a little bit of shade, but you're not going to get very good flower production if it's shaded. So for the maximum amount of flowers, make sure that it gets full sun as much as you can possibly provide. Now, so we talked a little bit about drip irrigation that first growing season, and I would certainly encourage you to do that. Now, what about the second growing season? Well, I would advise you to leave your drip irrigation in place for that second growing season because they're still young plants. And as we all know, our weather patterns can sometimes be very unpredictable. And here in Missouri, we have had several summers where we've had extended periods of drought. So even though lavender is a desert plant and it can tolerate some drought-like conditions, we want to make sure that we have water available when we have an extended period of drought. So having that drip irrigation already set up and ready to go on those second year plants and sometimes even beyond can be very helpful. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about soil requirements. Again, lavender has to have well-drained soil. Nothing will kill a lavender plant quicker than having wet feet, than having a drenched root zone. That leads to root rot. Diseases can happen very quickly and can spread throughout the planting. So we want to make sure that we have well-drained soil. So if we were ideally talking about soil, we want a kind of a sandy loam to a coarse gravelly combination, somewhere in that area. And again, we have a wide variety of soil types in Missouri, but our native soils, from what we have found in our research, have worked well. So you don't have to bring in compost, you don't have to do a big fussy regimen with your soil, just our native soil is fine. Now, one thing that you want to look at with your soil test is what is the pH of your soil? Well, for lavender, the ideal pH is going to be about 7, give or take a little less. Now, when we have a pH of 7 in our soil, that is going to allow nutrients that are in the soil to be taken up by the plant. If we have a pH that's too high or too low, that can actually cause nutrients in the soil to be in a form that is not available for the plant to take up. It binds chemically to soil particles and the plant can't access that. So there's a lot of chemistry that goes on in the soil. And one of the easiest ways to monitor that chemistry is by looking at our pH. And your soil test will help you to do that. Now, if you're unfamiliar with soil testing, any county, University of Missouri Extension office can process soil tests for you. Just call your local office, find out about details on what the cost is, when they accept the test, that sort of thing. But you can do that through your local MU Extension office. Another thing I want to mention about well-drained soil for lavender is sometimes we don't think about winter in terms of saturated soil. And, here in Missouri, we can have winters where we get a lot of rain, we get a lot of snow, we get a lot of ice, and that can cause that soil to stay wet for a long period of time. And in winter, lavender can still be susceptible to root rot diseases like Phytophthora or other types of diseases as well. So how do we get that well-drained soil? What can we do to improve our chances of success? Well, in our research plots, we used a raised row system. So basically, we would use some type of a tractor-mounted implement, and we would raise up those rows. 12 inches is the minimum. Try to go higher if you can, but that mounding of the soil is really going to help with soil drainage and is probably the number one thing you can do as either a home gardener or for a farmer to be successful. Make sure you start with those mounded rows to help with that drainage. Now for home gardeners, just a typical raised garden bed can also work really well. So any kind of a raised bed, raised row, it even works good in large containers if you want to plant lavender on your deck or patio or front porch. Raised containers work well. So again, raised rows, raised beds can work really well and be very beneficial for growing lavender. Now, another thing that I want to mention, especially for our farmers who want to commercially produce lavender, is in our research plots, we used black plastic landscape fabric over our raised rows. And a couple of benefits of using that black plastic on our rows is it can help to shed excess rainfall. So on our rows, we had our raised rows, we had the black plastic over the top, and then in between our rows, we had just grass, like lawn grass. And what happens when we get a really heavy rain is the black plastic sheds that excessive rainfall, and then the grass in between the rows soaks that up. So that was a really good combination that we found, and that worked really well. Now, the black plastic can also help with weed control because lavender does not compete well with weeds. So there's additional benefits to that as well. So again, do a soil test, find out what deficiencies that you have, start with your raised rows or raised beds. And then before you plant lavender, especially if you're going to do a large planting of it, observe the field or the area for a period of time, especially after heavy rains. Is there one spot in that field that's holding water or stays puddled for a long period of time? If so, you might want to avoid that for planting because that will, again, lead to root rot. So one of our biggest issues for lavender production in Missouri is winter protection. And we experimented with some different things with our lavender plots as far as winter protection. We did some comparisons throughout our years of research. Some of our rows we left uncovered. We just left them to the elements to do their own thing. Some of our rows we covered with frost protection, frost blankets. And so we compared the both. Do we just leave them open to the elements? Do we try to cover them up? And in our northern part of the state, in our Kirksville research plots, we, without question, found that the plants that were covered with winter protection survived very, very well. The ones that were not covered did not make it very well. Now, in the southern part of the state, we had a little bit of flexibility with that. We don't typically get as cold here as we do in the northern part of Missouri, so we got by with keeping some of our plants uncovered, and they also survived quite well. One thing to be cautious about if you are going to cover your lavender for winter is make sure you wait until that lavender has completely went dormant. And so as we start to get into the winter months, we can still have days or stretches of days where we have 50, 60 degree weather, and that can prevent some of our plants from completely going dormant. And what we found is that when we did cover our lavender, we would wait sometimes until even January, where we had an extended period of time where we were getting below freezing temperatures for several days. And that way we could ensure the plant was dormant, and then we can put the covering on at that time. If we don't wait for the plant to go dormant before applying the cover, it can remain basically alive and be more susceptible to winter damage. So that's why we like to wait until we have had, again, an extended period of time with those below freezing temperatures so we know that those plants go dormant. Another thing that we have experimented with in our research is high tunnel production of lavender. Now, if you're not familiar with the high tunnel growing system, it's basically an unheated greenhouse. And the reason that we wanted to experiment with high tunnel grown lavender is because having a protected culture for your plants, having that cover over the high tunnel, is able to, of course, shed excess rainfall, keep the soil dry for your plants, and not let them set in saturated soil. We did have some success in the high tunnel. We could have done some things differently in the winter because it actually got too dry in the tunnel. We had taken all of our irrigation up for the winter and it actually got too dry in there. So if we had more research time to work on this, we would look at more winter irrigation because it just was a little too dry in there. But I do think that there is good possibilities for high tunnel lavender production as far as winter protection and just better able to protect the plants. And, we also need some economic studies on that as well. But I think there's a lot of great potential for growing it in a high tunnel. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pruning lavender. So again, lavender is a perennial plant that can live many years, but it's also a woody plant. And so a woody plant is any plant like trees or shrubs that has a woody bark or stem on them, and lavender is no exception. As the plant gets older, it starts to get more woodiness to the plant. And once that happens, it can affect flower production. So we want to make sure that we're doing good pruning practices with our lavender to keep it at peak performance. And so a couple of basic rules of thumb for pruning lavender is you never want to remove more than a third of the plant. Now you can use hand pruners, you can use hedge pruners. We actually used kind of a miniature hedge pruner in our research plot, and it made quick work of pruning our plants. So again, you don't want to take off more than a third of the growth on the plant, and you never want to cut down into that woody part. You just cut off a third of the new growth, and that's really all you need to do. And as far as the overall shape of the plant, when you're done pruning, you want it to look like a basketball, okay? You want it to be a nice rounded shape, and then that's the shape that you want to keep that plant at as it advances in age. So the goal is a basketball shape, and never remove more than a third of the foliage of the plant. Now you can prune your plants in the spring. You can prune them in the fall after blooming is complete. There's some different trains of thought on when we should prune, but a couple of times a year will be fine. And of course it depends on the age of the plant as well, how much pruning you're going to need to do. Okay, well, let's talk about harvesting lavender, because this is an important part of, you've done all of this hard work, you've grown your crop, and now it's time to harvest your flowers. So you want to harvest your lavender when the bottom flowers are starting to open up. Okay, so lavender grows on a flower spike. So you're going to have a spike, and there's going to be lots of little miniature flowers up and down the spike. And those will open at different times. And so it will start by the flowers at the bottom of the spike will start to open, and then it will progress up that stem. So if you harvest them when the bottom flowers are open, the flowers are at their peak for color and oil production at that time. Another thing you want to do when you harvest lavender is harvest early in the morning. If you harvest early in the morning, the essential oils are at their peak in that plant. As we get into the hot part of the day, that dissipates a little bit. So again, make sure you're harvesting in the morning and harvesting when just the bottom flowers on that spike are starting to open. That's going to give you peak, again, color and fragrance and essential oils at that time. And basically you just want to cut the stems down to the foliage. The flower stems will grow up out of the foliage, and you just want to come in and cut those off. You can use scissors, you can use hand pruners, anything that you feel comfortable using is the best. Again, if you want to learn more about essential oil production, we will have a separate video in this series on how to do that. Okay, so dried bundles. Well, dried bundles are very popular with our lavender growers. Most will sell dried bundles in some form, whether it be at a farmer's market or online. People love dried lavender bouquets. And the cool thing about dried lavender bouquets is that they can hold their color and fragrance for many, many years. So this is a version of the dried lavender bundle that's been made with ribbon, and you may have seen this type of dried lavender bundle before. And basically the part with the flowers on it, you just kind of break that, turn it over, and then weave this ribbon in and out of it. That's one way to do it, or you can just leave the ribbon off and just have the flowers on it. But once they are dried, again, it's amazing that the color and the fragrance can last for years. Now, you want to keep them out of direct sunlight because that can affect that, but it's amazing that can happen. So to dry your lavender, you want to hang them upside down in a dry location for about 10 to 14 days. They're going to dry quickly, but you want to make sure that they're not getting rained on or they're not in direct sun. And just basically have you a bundle like this, hang it upside down, and it will dry in a few days' time. And the reason that you want to hang it upside down is because the lavender will dry straight like we see here. This is like perfectly straight. If you were to dry it like this, it's going to flop over and kind of be more out to the side, which is also a nice look as well if you want to put it in an arrangement. But most of our bundles are dried upside down. So what about insect issues when it comes to lavender? Well, so one of the good things about lavender is that there's not a lot of things out there that like to eat it. You know, a lot of people ask, what can I grow? I have deer in my yard. What can I grow that deer don't like to eat? Well, deer don't like lavender. Lavender contains camphor, and that is a very strong flavor that deer and rabbits and other animals don't like the taste of. So that's pretty good, but also a lot of our harmful insect pests don't like the taste of that either. So lavender doesn't really have a lot of insect pests. In our research plots, the main issue that we had was spider mites. And if you're not familiar with spider mites are a tiny little mite that's very hard to see with the naked eye, and they build webbing on your plants, and you can see the webbing, and they basically suck all of the juices out of the plants. And what happens if you do have an infestation of spider mites is, again, you might not be able to see them with the naked eye, but you will start to see a change in the color of your foliage. You'll start to see some yellow discoloration on the foliage, maybe some black spots on the foliage. And if you do happen to see that, make sure that you get down and inspect closely with a hand lens, and you'll see them on there. Now, spider mites like all kinds of plants. They love all kinds of our gardening plants, and they like the hot, dry part of the summer. So that's when we typically see spider mite infestations, is when we have a long period of just hot, dry weather. Spider mites thrive in that. Now, how do you control spider mites if you do have a problem? Well, you will have to use a miticide, okay? Spider mites are not insects, they're mites. So a typical insecticide that we would use for other garden pests, for the most part, won't affect mites. You want to read labels carefully. We did use a miticide in our research plots, and it took care of the problem. So do keep that in mind. Make sure, again, that you're reading the label carefully, that you're mixing it up correctly, and that you're applying it correctly. Now, another thing I'll say about using a miticide or any other types of chemicals on your plants, lavender is very, very attractive to our pollinators and our beneficial insects. One of my favorite parts of doing lavender research was being out in the research plots, seeing all of the bees and butterflies and other pollinators. And so if we're spraying chemicals, we don't want to kill off our pollinators. So some things to keep in mind if you do need to spray a miticide, make sure that you have harvested the flowers off that plant, okay? So if you need to spray, go out and harvest the flowers off of that plant, okay? So that's going to prevent beneficial insects from being there. So harvest those flowers, and then also apply at dusk. Okay, so most bees and other pollinators are not out feeding at dusk. And so that is a great time to spray a miticide or anything else you need to do. So do keep that in mind as well. Another thing we saw with some of our research is an issue with spittle bugs. We found that they would show up late in the season after the heavy harvest had already been done. So it didn't end up being a problem that we needed to spray for. We just kind of left them to do their thing. But we did notice some spittle bug issues. Again, lavender is highly, highly attractive to bees and butterflies and pollinators. It actually makes a great companion to beekeepers. So if you keep bees, oh my goodness, they love lavender. So a lot of our commercial lavender producers here in Missouri also have bees. And they have, lavender honey as well. So a great companion plant for our beekeepers. I'd like to thank you for watching this video, and just a reminder that lavender can be a great value-added product for your farming operation, and lots of different things can be made from it. If you want to re-watch this video, you can find that information at webcityfarmersmarket.com. If you want to access our grower guide for lavender in the state of Missouri, that will be available in the months to come at our extension website, which is extension.missouri.edu. And I would also like to thank some of our partners on this video series: Web City Farmers Market, the University of Missouri Extension, Lincoln University, and the Missouri Department of Agriculture.